My name is Michele St Pierre. I'm a PhD student at the University of British Columbia, and I study cannabis and pain. Okay, so today I have the difficult job of summarizing how cannabis is used for pain and what the research says. This is not a new area. Cannabis has been used for pain for thousands of years. Our first medical texts document its use for pain. And when we look at the rates of cannabis today, pain is still the most prominent condition for which cannabis is used. So we know people are using it at high rates, but we're not exactly sure how cannabis actually helps people with their pain. So I'll be diving into that today, a little bit about the sensory components of pain, but definitely with a focus on the emotional or the affective pain relief that cannabis may be able to provide.
Our next speaker is inspirational, someone who has changed our focus here at CannSolve and at our seminars to include one of the most important areas that we could possibly hope to do, which is to engage with student researchers, folks that are on the cutting edge of today's cannabis knowledge, who are immersed in finding out where's the evidence, both for and against. And it inspired us to open up a time slot in every one of our presentations going forward to welcome folks who are in this particular type of programming to help you better answer that question, what's the evidence? And what does the research say about the use of cannabis? So it is my great pleasure today to welcome a wonderful researcher, Michele St Pierre. I had the privilege of seeing Michele speak at a conference in Toronto at the CCIC. And for anybody who is particularly interested in getting onto the leading edge of where cannabis is going and where the medical research is, I really encourage you to look at ccic.net and take a look at the Canadian Consortium for the Investigation of Cannabinoids. It's a wonderful meeting place, very supportive and encouraging and an excellent place. And it was where I first got to see Michele presenting her research. She's working at UBC with a talented group of folks over there, and I'm just so incredibly grateful that she could join us here today. Michele St Pierre is a doctoral student in clinical psychology at the University of British Columbia and a Vanier Canada graduate scholar. She researches the association between cannabis use and pain, and she is currently the study coordinator for a CIHR-funded study assessing the psychosocial impact of cannabis legalization on young adults. And for anybody who knows, when you're working at the level of CIHR, you're in very good company indeed, working amongst the best of the best researchers. So we're very grateful to have her here. Michele co-authored the widely disseminated Sensible Cannabis Education Toolkit, which was voted the #1 cannabis education resource in 2018 by the National Institute for Cannabis Health and Education. Please join me in welcoming Michele St Pierre.
Okay, great. Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for being here today. I've been researching cannabis for the last 5 years, and in particular, cannabis and pain for the last 3 years. So I'm really looking forward to sharing with you some of what I know. Before I begin, I want to disclose that I have been paid as a graduate student research assistant on a clinical trial assessing cannabis for post-traumatic stress disorder. Research is far outpacing government funding opportunities, so a lot of us research folks are turning to industry to fill that void. So cannabis and pain. This is an incredibly broad research area. So I've tried to organize the talk today into a few discrete sections. I'm hoping that I can give you an overview of what we know and then how that research can apply to your work in the clinic. Some of the best presentations that I've been to start with, making sure that we're all on the same page with the background information before adding to it. So I hope that you'll find the Pain 101 and Cannabis 101 sections useful. And then I break cannabis analgesia down into 4 different pain types. So I think that this is the most useful way to translate the findings to the clinic and individual patients, but it's also important to have a more sort of accurate picture of what's going on. When we see these sort of large studies that combine across all pain types, all cannabinoid medicines, the effect really goes away because there's just too much variability in that. So today I'll be talking about chronic pain, neuropathic pain, cancer pain, and acute pain. And what I've done is I've tried to pull sort of the all-star systematic reviews for each of those pain conditions, and then provide a bit of a summary at the end to try to keep it as unambiguous as possible. but it's difficult. Okay, so definitions, of course, enable us to have a common understanding of a particular subject. So today I felt it was important to start with how we want to talk about pain. I know that pain is something, we all know about. Maybe it would seem silly to start with a definition, but I think that really, truly, we sort of all come at pain from slightly different angles. So pain can be defined as an unpleasant, emotional, and sensory experience that's unique to the individual. And earlier this year, the Canadian Pain Task Force was established to help the Government of Canada better understand and address the needs of Canadians who live with pain. So, not surprisingly, the task force found that chronic pain is one of the most common reasons for seeking healthcare in Canada. 1 in 4 Canadians experience chronic pain, and the direct and indirect costs of that are enormous, so about $60 billion per year, just alone in Canada. And pain can be really challenging to treat because you see 2 patients with seemingly similar injuries, yet only one is debilitated by it. So that can leave, the physician, the psychologist, the nurse, really all of us, the patient, feeling quite perplexed at what is going on. And when I first started studying pain, I, as a clinical psychologist in training, of course, I'm quite focused on the mind and how we think and feel. And I was really surprised to find out that pain was as much of an affective and emotional experience as it was sensory. And I think that this this excerpt from a recent article paints that quite nicely. Pain is an affect, a subjective aspect of emotion, a combination of innate endowment, so genetics, childhood and adult history, and it's metabolized through the consciousness of the person. So I hate the saying, but I'm gonna say it, it's all in your head. We've heard that, hopefully we haven't said it in the last, couple decades, but truly pain comes from sensory neurons in our periphery that travel up to the brain where it is processed. So pain does arise in our consciousness. And so I think it's really important that we remember that when we're thinking about treating pain. But this complex nature, this inherently personal nature of pain makes it difficult to understand another's experience, makes it difficult to research it, quite frankly. So our gold standard of assessing pain is asking someone, how bad does it hurt? Tell me, 0 to 10. But that's what we have to go off of. And so to better understand pain, we've broken it down into sort of 3 different aspects. This is pain processing. So we have the sensory discriminative aspect of pain. This is probably the one we're most familiar with. The location, the quality, and the intensity of the pain. We then have the affective motivational component. This is the feelings of unpleasantness, distress, maybe threat that you feel from the pain, like, oh, I'm not gonna be able to do what I need to do, or how bad is this gonna get? And then the cognitive evaluative, which refers to, the attitudes and the beliefs about the pain, how you interact with people in your life, your workplace, that sort of thing. So these 3 aspects are really important to keep in mind when we consider pain treatments for patients, because if we can target one of the aspects of pain processing, we have an opportunity to have a more global impact on someone's pain. So the gate control theory of pain, I have these 2 fabulous men over there, Melzack and Wall. They proposed this theory in the 60s that's quite popular nowadays. And essentially they say that we have gates in our spinal cord that sort of open or close, and those allow pain signals to be transmitted to the brain. There's a bunch of different things that control the gate. So if you hit your knee on the corner in your kitchen, and then you do that really fast, you sort of create, extra sensation. That's blocking some of the initial pain sensation. Well, actually, there's psychological components that can do the same thing. So, if you're not sleeping well, if you're quite distressed, if you're, unsupported by the people in your life, then more pain may be able to travel through those gates. All right, so that was Pain 101. So now we'll turn to cannabis. So what's cannabis being used for? Well, of course, pain. That's why we're here. This is the latest Canadian statistics. Other research has shown that cannabis is used for pain in about 70% of patients, so pretty high rates of cannabis use for pain, followed by mood and insomnia. And I don't think it's a stretch to extrapolate from these high rates that people perceive cannabis as helping with their pain. One of my committee members for my dissertation, Dr. Ethan Russo, has said that no medicine is successful commercially or otherwise unless the patient perceives that they are helped by its use. So I think that that's important sort of to begin our discussion about cannabis and pain, is that people wouldn't necessarily be using it at such a high rate if it wasn't helping. And this is a really important time to be looking at this. High rates of cannabis use for pain aren't exclusive to patients. So this was a recent study out of Colorado. They went to a dispensary, they excluded everybody who was authorized for medical cannabis. So they just asked the recreational folks, what are you using cannabis for? Super high rates for sleep and pain. So now that we have legalized non-medical cannabis in Canada, there's certainly going to be a lot more folks walking through your door at your clinic who are going to be managing pain and other symptoms. But people have been using cannabis for pain since before we have recorded history. So several of our ancient medical texts from several different regions document the use of cannabis for pain. And even up until, last century, it was widely used as a medicine. It was in the US pharmacopoeia till 1942. Doctors were comfortable with it, and it was sold by major pharmaceutical companies like Eli Lilly. And I don't know if any of you remember, but there's this really weird thing that happened just for a couple years, which truly, when we look back at history, it will be just this little tiny blip where cannabis was prohibited. And now, welcome to today. Canadians have been authorized to use cannabis since, the early 2000s. And there's over 340,000 patients in the system currently. So, that sounds like a lot of people to me, but of course now we're gonna have a lot more people because there's less barriers to access now that you don't necessarily need authorization. So that number is definitely higher. So Dr. McCallum did such a great job already of sort of explaining the endocannabinoid system and endocannabinoids, so I'll breeze over this section a little bit, but the endocannabinoid system is a homeostatic regulator. So one researcher made this nice, cute little poem about what the endocannabinoid system could do. So it could help relax, eat, sleep, forget, protect. It is the most numerous receptor system in our body, which I find quite interesting, 10 times more abundant than opioid receptors. And we have anandamide as one of our endocannabinoids that's produced. So this is chemically quite similar to THC, so that's kind of neat. And it's produced when we injure ourselves. So it can suppress sensation and inflammation through all those various targets that Dr. McCallum reviewed. So this is kind of cool because I think that this was the case study that she was referring to. And it's one of my favorite sort of anecdotes about the role of anandamide and endocannabinoid system in pain. So, this might be something that you can take away to the dinner table later to remember that we have this system that's quite involved in pain relief. So this woman likened childbirth to a tickle. So certainly something was going on for her. And sure enough, as Dr. McCallum said, they did a blood plasma assessment or analysis, and she had these just really, really high levels of anandamide coursing through her veins. Okay, so now we're going to turn over to the different types of pain. So this was one of the larger systematic reviews that's been done on cannabinoids for chronic pain. It was published in JAMA, so kind of, one of the bougier journals out there, pretty hard to get published in there if your science isn't up to snuff. And it's been cited almost 1,000 times. I just checked last night. It's really been widely disseminated. I also like it because it combines a bunch of different cannabinoid medicines, which I find quite interesting, just sort of maybe some parallels between those that, it wasn't just focused on Sativex or something. And all the studies were placebo-controlled or had an active comparator. They found that there was moderate quality evidence to support the use of cannabinoids for the treatment of chronic pain and spasticity. So, a short-term randomized control trial isn't exactly how your patient with chronic pain is going to be using cannabis, for 3 weeks or something like that. So Mark Ware over at McGill, Dr. Mark Ware, conducted the first cohort study of the long-term safety of medical cannabis. So they recruited patients from 7 different clinics across Canada who were finding that conventional treatments were inadequate for managing their pain. And then they created 2 groups, people that were just naturally already using cannabis, and then people that were not. And there was a mix of neuropathic, nociceptive pain. Both samples were matched across a number of different characteristics, and there's about 50% use of opioids and antidepressants in each group. And they found that the cannabis users did get cannabis every week for the duration of the study. So that's definitely something that you have to keep in mind. The control group wasn't sort of getting anything free. But the cannabis users did show a significant reduction in pain intensity over 1 year. And they also had improvements in symptom, distress, and mood disturbance. So see if this is super blurry. Oh, it's not even that bad. Great. So just for the visual learners here, this is basically what I've just said in visual form from the paper. And you can see that the cannabis users actually had higher baseline pain when they first started the study, but by the end of it, they actually had less pain than the controls. So this wasn't a study looking at the use of cannabis for pain, the efficacy of it, it was more the safety. And so some of the other outcomes they found were sort of no decreases in neurocognitive function. It was well tolerated. And then I guess sort of the benefits was that people's pain got a little bit better. So to conclude, pulling from that same great document that Dr. McCallum mentioned, in the chronic pain section, this committee decided that there was substantial evidence that cannabis is an effective treatment for chronic pain. Okay, so now switching gears to neuropathic pain, you already got a little bit of a hint that cannabis can be effective for that. And this was, again, a large systematic review, one of the larger ones that's been done in this area, 178 participants across 5 different studies. And they found that there was a 30% reduction in pain scores in response to inhaled cannabis when compared to a placebo. The study reported the findings in a numbers needed to treat metric. So this is essentially how many, for those of you that don't know, how many people you sort of need to treat before you see an effect. And they found that the number needed to treat for cannabis in neuropathic pain was 5. I'm excited for Dr. Mitchell's presentation later on gabapentin, but inhaled cannabis, 5, gabapentin is about a 6 or 7. So it seemed like cannabis was as potent as gabapentin. And again, for the visual learners, this is global impression of pain relief and then time across the x-axis. And you can see that there's definitely a dose response of, the higher potency cannabis, lower, and then placebo at the bottom there, and sort of peaking at, 4 to 8 puffs, so just over an hour in, people are finding a bit of relief. I do want to draw your attention to the absurdly low potency cannabis that was supplied by NIDA over there. So it's 1.29% THC and 3.5% THC. Certainly, I think that, and I'll get to in a little while, that lower potency cannabis is demonstrated to be quite effective for certain pain conditions. So that's not a slight necessarily against NIDA, but I think that it would be difficult for people to maybe get some of these lower potency cannabis. That's not really like the popular potency of cannabis you're gonna find. All right, so now switching gears to cancer pain. So this one just came out. I was pretty excited about that in October, just in time for all of us today. It was just over 1,500 participants across 5 RCTs. These authors concluded that there was actually, the evidence that existed was low quality and that cannabinoid medicines have no effect on pain. This is systematic review, so they've taken a lot of evidence and synthesized it for one finding. There are other sort of single, studies that have shown that people are reporting that cannabis is effective for their pain, sort of outside of these RCT models. So that's not to say it sounds definitive, and I want to present because that's what the authors have said, but there does seem to be definitely some secondary outcomes that we can look at. So cancer patients were not escalating their opioid doses the same way that people not using cannabis, and they also were reporting a better quality of life. So it's having some sort of impact. It just might not be directly on the cancer pain. And now switching gears to acute pain. So acute pain in cannabis is kind of my niche, I guess. I am really, really fascinated by this work. If you've ever used cannabis while in acute pain, you might also be interested in this research area. So I'll leave you with that, and we'll kind of go to the next slide. So this just came out in JAMA, I think the end of last year, and this looked at all of the different studies that have assessed cannabis for acute pain in the laboratory. So experimental pain is sort of our best model for acute pain in the lab. Of course, it's not identical. If you go into a laboratory and a scientist says, put your hand in a bucket of ice water and then take it out when you want to, that's kind of how we induce pain in a lot of ways. So obviously you have a lot of control over it. It's not the same as sort of, having your arm in a cast and having to deal with that for 6 weeks. But nevertheless, it is pain. And so it's so weird, but like half of the studies show that cannabis actually caused pain, and so, or was associated with increases in pain. And that is, that kind of really got me going. I was quite, I guess, nervous about that because we see such high rates of cannabis use for pain. So I started to think, is something going on? Is cannabis changing how we process pain? And that's actually what I looked at for my master's thesis. So I'll get into that in 1 second, but I will say that, overall, when they synthesized all of that evidence in that review, they found that there were some small increases in things like pain threshold and pain unpleasantness, but pain intensity, which is more of that sensory component, was not affected. And so, as I said, I looked at that in my master's, so with some of my committee members. It's under review right now, but what we did was we took a bunch of healthy folks who used cannabis quite frequently, three or more times a week, and we got a matched group of people that don't use cannabis, and we ran them through that pain paradigm I talked about, sort of the cold presser. So we had them stick their hand in a bucket of ice water just to see, is pain unpleasantness different when you're not high or when you're not under the effects of cannabis? Is pain different? Pain intensity? Is pain tolerance different? Because I'm not sure who's familiar with opioid hyperalgesia, but it's this phenomenon that can occur from long-term opioid therapy where you become sensitized to sort of just all other pain. And so I was worried that that's what we were seeing in sort of that first third of the studies are maybe we, really doing a disservice. Maybe cannabis is actually making people hurt worse. Well, the good news is there's absolutely no difference between how people process pain. Like, I've never seen such similar results between the groups. So it's one piece of evidence that cannabis is at least safer in that regard when you compare it to opioids. This editorial just came out. I definitely recommend it. Dr. Russo is a physician, and it's definitely kind of geared to folks in the clinic. I think it sort of poses some challenging questions just about, the limits on the type of evidence we have, but sort of trudging forward anyways for the patient. But Dr. Russo certainly isn't impressed with cannabis for acute pain. He says it's unimpressive as an analgesic for acute pain, with the possible exception of breakthrough pain or in conjunction with opioids. So to summarize, it looks like cannabis has some demonstrated efficacy for chronic pain, for neuropathic pain, but less so for those acute pains. And while this might be a clue, I think that cannabis is targeting more of those affective, cognitive aspects of pain and less so the sensory, because when you think about those sort of longer term pain conditions, you have a lot more of an emotional aspect involved. And it just so happens that this theory has a neurobiological correlate. So we have quite a dense sort of distribution of cannabinoids in the area of the brain that processes sort of affective qualities of pain. So this was a study in 15 young, healthy men, and they ran them through, again, a pain paradigm in the lab, but they did find that THC reduced unpleasantness, but not intensity. So I'm cognizant of the fact that it seems there's some contradictory cannabis research coming out quite frequently. At least that's how it feels to me. I'll spend a couple weeks thinking I really know something, and then the news is like, wow, cannabis is so bad for this thing that we've said it's really good for. And so you may feel like I do, banging my head against the wall sometimes, because I'm trying to figure out like what's going on, immediately going to the methodology in the paper and just trying to figure out, okay, where did they mess up, or what's some new sort of methodology that they have to hone in on this closer. So I thought that it was important, just as someone who produces research and as someone who consumes research, that we just discuss really briefly some of the things to consider when you yourself are going to the literature. So as I mentioned, different methodologies yield different results. Diversity of cannabinoid medicines. If one study says cannabis is effective for this, and they're using, inhaled high potency cannabis, and another study is looking at the exact same condition, but they're doing an oral CBD, or they're doing it in a mouse model, those types of things actually really matter. And then of course the diversity of pain conditions. So I recently submitted that paper that I mentioned from my master's thesis, and the reviewers came back and they said, actually, cannabis isn't effective for pain at all. You need to rewrite your whole introduction, and here's the literature on that. Sure enough, went to that literature, and they had combined all pain types in this one review. And so of course, when you just sort of dump everything into a bucket, you're gonna lose the effect for the one thing that you're looking for. So that's something really important to keep in mind. And then Dr. McCallum mentioned, endocannabinoid tone. So I think it's still a little bit of a theoretical idea. It's not something that we can necessarily measure in the clinic, but we probably know people, or I have friends who say like, I can never smoke cannabis because it just makes me like so anxious, and this might have something to do with just a difference in their tone. Okay, so now looking at pharmaceutical versus herbal. So I definitely am a proponent, just from what I've read, on sort of that entourage effect using full spectrum cannabis products. I think that there's a lot in cannabis that we don't know about yet. And as Dr. McCallum said, just 5 years ago, no one was talking about CBD, and now CBD is like all the rage. So important to maybe consider using whole plant products, but of course there's a lot of benefits to using pharmaceuticals. It might be covered by insurance plan, it's standardized, you might feel more comfortable with it, or the same might be true for your patient. But this one study looked at comparing just the effectiveness between the two, and they found that there was actually no difference in analgesic potential between dronabinol and inhaled cannabis compared to placebo, except for dronabinol produced analgesia that was of a longer duration, which is likely because you're swallowing it. So if they had swallowed just a capsule of THC, then perhaps they would have had the same effect. Okay, so this is another area that I'm quite interested in, and this came out of my research into acute pain. So this Wallace et al. Study in 2007 actually showed that at about 4% THC cannabis, people were having a nice analgesic response, pain was less, they were happy, but then when they gave them 8% THC, they actually had this inverse effect where the pain was worse. Another study of Sativex that came out in 2012 showed that people who were just doing 0 to 4 sprays a day of their Sativex actually had the greatest reduction in pain than people who were at the 4 to 8 range, and then the higher than that. So more cannabis isn't always better. And I think that we really need to strive for the lowest effective dose. I think that there's this misperception out there that you kind of gotta just be totally high to feel better, and that somehow is the therapeutic effect of cannabis. But Ethan Russo, and I think it actually might even be from Dr. McCallum's paper, where they say, you don't need the euphoric effect to derive a therapeutic benefit. If someone's using it for depression, for anxiety, or cancer, things like that, maybe where you do want to have some, more of a psychoactive euphoric effect, then for sure. But if you have people that don't necessarily want to be high, you don't need to be high for cannabis to be therapeutic. All right, so just with the last few minutes I have, I wanted to just touch on some of the other players in cannabinoid analgesia. I kind of just focused on cannabinoid medicines broadly today. As I said, CBD is just super hot right now. I think that what's the saying? We're putting the cart before the horse. So I don't think that we have a ton of evidence about cannabidiol, but absence of evidence is an evidence of absence. So certainly, it has a relatively good side effect profile, safety profile. And there is some evidence in animals that it can be effective. In one study I found that CBD spray was comparable again to gabapentin for neuropathic pain. And then I think something that we should all be on the lookout for is terpene research. So as Dr. McCallum said, terpenes are one of these other compounds in cannabis. They're the thing that give cannabis its smell. So terpenes are everywhere in nature. Lemons have limonene, makes it smell like a lemon. Cannabis also, some of them have limonene, which gives it a bit of a citrusy smell. And there's a lot of research that's starting to come out, specifically in animal models, that's showing that these terpenes might actually be one of the main sort of therapeutic aspects of cannabis. And the NIH, actually, I just got this to my email a couple days ago, that they just awarded $3 million to investigate the pain relieving properties. So 9 different studies in the States that are about to be going on. So some final thoughts. Cannabis is widely used for pain. It's been widely used for pain for likely thousands of years. I think the best I can say today is that there is evidence that cannabis can relieve some pain in some people. I think that we need to start relying on different types of evidence. So, my physician has said, we just don't know enough about cannabis, so we can't use it. And I totally understand that. I get that, from a beneficence, non-malfeasance sort of like perspective. That's how I'm being trained as well. But there's other ways to figure out if a medicine works for someone. And there's sort of this idea of these N of 1 designs. So hopefully that paper's not too blurry for you to see. But if you just go online and N of 1 designs, there's lots of resources out there to kind of guide you and help you be a little bit systematic with your patient, but to find out what type of cannabis works for what type of symptom. And due to the really personal nature of pain, I think that the patient experience is of paramount importance. And so again, working with the patient, if they're saying it's working, starting to understand how that might be. And I'll just leave you with one quote. Whether cannabis is the best treatment for pain or not, many patients around the world believe that cannabis has helped them with their pain. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Michele. We've got a little bit of time for questions, so if anyone has a question, please raise your hand and I'll bring the microphone over to you. Excellent.
I find the emerging evidence on terpenes really interesting, and in our pain clinic we've tried to use some of the synthetic cannabinoids like nabilone with very little success. What happens to terpenes when you try and make a synthetic cannabinoid? Does it just disappear, or?
That's a great question, and I'm not sure that I, have a really comprehensive answer for that. I know that Sativex does have some terpenes in it, but certainly that's why I would be encouraging people to use those full spectrum cannabis products. So I know even there's going to be things coming onto the market with the isolated, the extracts and things like that are going to have terpenes in them. But from what I've heard and talks that I've gone to, people are really encouraging, sort of the least isolated, and going for that entourage effect, because we just don't really know what is bringing all of the therapeutic effect, and it's likely, a case of the whole is greater than the sum of its part.
Any question?
Hi. I love that you brought up euphoria when we talk about the affective component. I just want to share to the patients that I've seen, the seniors, right? And I've done talks and then working with them. And there was a couple of examples I can give. Number one is a senior came up to me and she says, I take cannabis, which is THC, when we talk about that, and I laugh a little before bed. And she says, is that okay? And I said, well, is it okay for you? And she goes, yeah. And I said, then it's not a problem.
Yeah.
And then the second person with chronic pain said, oh, I took too much of my oil during the day and I couldn't stop laughing. And she was a senior. And she goes, I just couldn't get anything done. And I said, but what was the value of that laughter for that day? Yeah. Mm-hmm. And she said, no, it was. So I think, like, when you look at the psychological aspects like you're doing,
yeah,
I think actually we ought to do way more talking about that euphoria bit, because I noticed that physicians and nurses get uncomfortable with the euphoria, and that we actually need to talk about that specifically in particular. So
yeah,
I like that this is combined.
Definitely. I think our society, we somehow demonize pleasure. And we can look back a couple hundred years and sort of see where that's come from. But yeah, certainly you're right. I think that, it's kind of funny to read the research. I presented last week for the BC Cancer Agency on cannabis for symptom management. And so that research, shows that cannabis is a really effective antiemetic. So more so than some of the widely prescribed medications available. And this one paper I read said that patients reported that it was as effective, but that there were these quote unquote beneficial side effects. So it is a side effect of cannabis for sure, is improved mood, euphoria, sedation, things like that. So yeah, certainly I don't think someone feeling good when they're living with pain is necessarily bad, but it's for those people that maybe don't want to feel that there are options. You don't have to feel that.
Are they liking it too much? Therefore, they equate the euphoria with a risk. That's what I'm sort of thinking.
Yeah, and I think it just comes down to understanding pain from more of a comprehensive perspective, that it isn't just the relief at the site of the injury, so to speak. It's sort of a whole thing. So if cannabis can help you feel a little bit better, so that then you want to go out with your child, or you want to go walk your dog, or you're laughing for the first time in months with your spouse, things like that, those are all actually going to reduce your pain. And there's a large body of research, the biopsychosocial model of pain. So we have to think of pain more holistically, I think.
Thank you. Do we have another question over here? Somebody waiting for the microphone? Yeah, over here? Okay.
Hi, I was just wondering if there's been much research on topical application for pain?
So what I've read and heard about the topical application is we don't really know how or if cannabis is actually getting through the skin. The skin's a very good barrier. So it's quite impressive that people are finding that it is getting through. What I've read is that things like capsaicin, or things that sort of disrupt that barrier a little bit, might actually be helpful at sort of allowing the cannabinoids to get in there. But from what I've heard, topical cannabis is better for skin sort of issues, and I think there's less evidence that it's actually getting down into the joint. But Dr. McCallum's certainly more of an expert in that area, and she knows some of the synovial fluid and stuff. So yeah.
Just as you were talking about euphoria, made me think about the idea that you can't just numb one feeling, that so a lot of people talk about when they take medications, it numbs all their feelings. And I just think that's really interesting in this context. I'm wondering if you have any thoughts about that.
Can you say a bit more?
So the idea that like when you take a substance that numbs pain or numbs feeling, that regulates mood, for instance, that you would be then not able to have other feelings with the same clarity or intensity.
Right.
And it's interesting what you're saying about cannabis and what I know about cannabis, in that it's numbing pain, but it's not necessarily numbing positive affect.
Yeah.
So I'm just curious if you have any thoughts about that.
Yeah, for sure. So, I mean, I don't study sort of the pharmacokinetics and things like that of drugs as much. I'm more of like, the sort of behavioral and things like that. But certainly other pain medications have been known to just sort of dampen across sort of systems. But yeah, cannabis, I think it also, when we're talking about cannabis, that's sort of just like a category of drugs. There's so much variability in there. So I think some cannabinoid medicines can do a little bit more of that numbing. Taking a high dose edible is probably not going to make you feel a heck of a lot. But perhaps, smoking or inhaling, vaporizing a strain that's higher in something that's a little bit more euphoric, like limonene or something like that. So I think that it's hard to say that cannabis is going to do one thing for your mood. I think that cannabis, there are many drugs within that can do different things to mood. THC can make you really anxious. So I don't think that there can be a blanket statement necessarily that cannabis is going to do, is just going to make everyone feel great. Certainly not. But yeah, it can. I definitely do think that targeting that affective component of pain, as a psychologist in training, I think that that's probably really the most significant target for cannabis analgesia.
Wonderful. Do we have any other questions for our break? Wonderful. Okay, I'd like to give a great big round of applause, please, for Michele St Pierre.